The time is at hand.
The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order.
One of the many spirits said to haunt the area.
Unknown animal attack.
We need a great reset.
Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen.
From 659 feet up in the Appalachian Mountains, this is In Dark Places. My name is Junebug Fugit. Hot enough for you? I've been kind of cooking since my transmission tore up in the Jeep. I've got a good air conditioner in the Jeep, but the other two vehicles don't have air conditioning, and it's been kind of hot. On one hot day last week, I was sitting out in my truck editing episode 116. I had my window down, I was cooking, and there's this guy parked across from me, howled at me like a werewolf. Oh! And I just kept editing my little show and didn't even look up to acknowledge him. And then a couple of seconds later, he did it again. Oh! And I still didn't look up at him. And I guess he gave up on me and just backed out of the parking lot and left then. I have some new ghost activity down at my parents' house. My sister came in from South Carolina on Memorial Day and spent most of the day down at my parents' house. And normally Brandon will watch TV in my room with my niece whenever they come in. After my sister left on Memorial Day, I went down and got Brandon's adapter for his Nintendo Switch out of my room. He forgot and left it down there. And I went in, there was nothing out of the ordinary going on. The TV was off, and I got the adapter and left. But on Saturday night, June 3rd, we were out in the driveway getting ready to leave, and I kind of glanced backward and saw a light in my room. And me and Brandon went in to investigate, and the TV was on in my room. There's nobody there, except for the ghost. My dad used to talk about how the TV out in the living room would turn itself on like that in the middle of the night while he was asleep. He would wake up the next morning and the TV would be on. So what we have here is a ghost that likes to watch TV. Crop circle found in Italian wheat field by Tim Bernal. Thanks, Tim. In a relatively rare case of the crop circle phenomenon occurring outside the United Kingdom, a rather sizable formation has been found in an Italian wheat field. According to a local media report, the curious design was discovered earlier this week by a bicyclist cruising down on a road in the community of Caprano del Calais. Measuring nearly 200 feet in diameter, the somewhat complex formation consists of a small circle of wheat alongside a larger crescent shape that envelops a dot of crops. The puzzling scene has already drawn a fair share of visitors eager to get a look at the odd sight and offer their thoughts on what could have created it. As one might imagine, the suggestions are in keeping with the long-standing theories surrounding the phenomenon, with some postulating to a media outlet that it was the work of aliens, while others argue that the design was crafted by a talented human. Crop circles appearing in Italy is not entirely unheard of, as they have been previously reported around once a year in the country during the 2010s, with the most recent incident occurring back in May of 2020. The discovery of the Caprano del Calais design comes just days after the 2023 crop circle season officially kicked off in the UK, with the year's first formation being found over the weekend. And now here is the Nicolas Cage Meltdown of the Week.
Would you like for me to say a few words?
You said plenty of words. None of them helped.
An astonishing series of events in Dyfed, Wales, in 1977 drew UFO enthusiasts and investigators from all over the country. This is the story of the Welsh Triangle by Hilary Evans. Thanks, Hilary. UFOs in the sky and on the ground. Cars pursued by orange footballs. Glowing cigars hovering over schools. Discs flying into solid rock and vanishing between sliding doors. Silver-suited entities with no faces stalking across fields and peering through cottage windows. Mysteriously malfunctioning cars, televisions, and radio sets. Visits from sinister aliens with psychic powers. The teleportations of entire herds of cattle. Such, if the reports are to be believed, are just some of the extraordinary events that occurred, not in some far-off land, but in peaceful, homely Wales, and not at some distant time, but as recently as the spring of 1977. I don't know, this is pretty distant. The build-up to the events of 1977 had begun before the close of the previous year. Already, residents of this remote corner of Wales were reporting UFO sightings on a scale that led Randall Jones Pugh, a local British UFO Research Association investigator who was interviewed by a journalist on January 13th to forecast, "The country is in for a spat of such incidents." His prediction was confirmed on the afternoon of February 4th when he received a telephone call from the mother of a pupil at nearby Broadhaven Primary School, saying that her son, along with a dozen other children, had seen a UFO that afternoon, over a period of some hours, on the grounds close to the school. Although the Broadhaven School incident was not the most sensational event of the West Wales flap, the events were the first to alert the general public to the fact that something extraordinary was taking place in the locality. And unlike some of the later occurrences, the facts, if not the explanations for them, are reasonably well established. First sighting took place during the lunch break when a group of boys, aged between 9 and 11, who were playing football in a field beside the school, noticed an unfamiliar object in another field close by. It was apparently at ground level and was partly obscured by trees and bushes, so they could discern only its upper portions. They could see enough, however, to feel sure that it was a UFO. Some of the boys rushed into the school with the news. Others came out to see what it was. Eventually there were 15 children who saw the object. They described it as being as long as a coach, or maybe a bit longer. One description was of 2 saucers, stacked one against the other to make a sort of dome, with a round ashtray added to make a smaller dome on top. One boy saw 3 or 4 windows around the edge, on top of the dome. Others thought they saw 10 or 11. Several thought they saw a light flashing on top, and one witness claimed that it was red. One saw a door on the side, with a runway leading down from it. Some, but not all, heard a humming sound. In addition, 6 of the witnesses reckoned that they saw 1 or 2 entities near the object. "We saw something come out of it. It had a helmet," said one. A second described a silver man with spiked ears, while a third added, "He wasn't a very tall person. He didn't look very nice either." The children watched the object for some 20 minutes. 2 of them went to tell the headmaster, but he does not seem to have been sufficiently convinced to come to see for himself, though one boy was nearly crying because he was so scared that he was going to be disintegrated or something. At 2 p.m., they went back into class to reemerge at 3:30. Naturally, they returned to the field at once to see if their UFO was still there. At first, they couldn't see it, and they tried to get closer, though this meant crossing a fence and a stream. But just then, the UFO popped up again from behind a bush, and they all took to their heels. This time, they reported a cigar object seemed to be tugging an object which was silver. Again, it disappeared behind a bush. Many of the children told their parents about the incident when they got home. Randall Jones Pug's name was familiar in the region as that of the local UFO specialist, so it was natural that he should be the first one to be contacted. At 6 p.m., he visited the site with one of the boys. By now, however, it was raining heavily, and the light was fading fast, so he returned the next morning with a reporter from the Western Telegraph. However, no traces of the landing were to be seen. News of the occurrence spread rapidly, and the tiny seaside village immediately found itself the center of intense interest. On Monday, the headmaster overcame his initial skepticism and asked the witnesses to draw what they had seen. By this time, the children had had plenty of opportunity to discuss the matter both among themselves and with inquirers and reporters. The consensus was that they had seen a silver cigar-shaped object with a dome and possibly a light. It was in much the same terms that, 2 weeks later, one of the teachers described a large object that she had seen on the same spot, though she glimpsed it for only 4 or 5 seconds, and in the pouring rain, she was about to call others when it glided away with a humming sound. Later that day, 2 other adults, canteen workers at the school, noticed an object in the same place, saw a figure climb into it, and watched it move up a slope. They did not think for one moment that they were watching a UFO, but considered that it was a vehicle associated with the sewage works close by. Even when it was pointed out that it would have been very difficult for any type of vehicle to get in that location, they refused to accept that they had seen a UFO. On February 10th, 1977, 2 12-year-old boys saw a UFO in a field near Haverford West Grammar School. It was a blue flashing light seen at a distance of about 130 yards. One boy threw a stone at it, whereupon it took off. As it did so, an orange cigar shape about 16 feet long materialized beneath it. It hovered for a while and then vanished. On February 16th, Graham Howells, a 13-year-old schoolboy of Pembroke Dock, saw a bright metallic object hovering over Pembroke School as he arrived in the morning. Although the weather was misty, he claimed a clear view of the object, which had a dome in the middle, which was dark gray most of the time, but flashed to a dazzling white about every 5 seconds. It resembled a plate with a burnt fried egg on it. Around the rim of the plate, it had greeny, yellowish lights, and what seemed to be retro rockets. The plate seemed to be revolving as well. It wasn't a helicopter or a weather balloon. On March 13th, Stephen Taylor, aged 17, saw a UFO at about 9 p.m. It was a glowing light with an orange halo around it. He went to the house of some friends to tell them about it, but they did not believe him. About half an hour later, in a field, he saw a dome-shaped UFO about 20 feet high and stopped to look at it. Then a figure like a tall man approached, wearing a semi-transparent suit and a kind of spaceman's helmet. "I was so frightened that I just took a swing at it and ran," Stevens said. On April 7th, Cyril John, aged 64, woke up at about 4:45 a.m., disturbed by a strange orange light pulsating in his bedroom. It came from outside and was reflected off the walls. He got up and looked out the window and saw that the sky was orange. "Immediately outside here, I saw two silvery-colored objects. The first was like a very large Easter egg, about 4 feet in diameter, and it was swinging back and forth a little above and behind the chimneys of the house opposite. I then saw an object like a man in a silvery boiler suit, about 50 feet above my window. It was at least 7 feet tall, and hung stationary on a level with the Easter egg. Its altitude was in the position of a free-falling parachute jumper. It hung motionless in the sky, face forward for about 25 minutes, and the egg then moved up above roof level and glided away sideways, as did the figure." On April 19th, Mrs. Rose Granville, proprietor of the Havenport Hotel, was just going to bed at about 2 a.m. I know the feeling. It's always around 2 o'clock when I go to bed. I want to go to bed around 11, but for some reason it's always around 2 whenever I go to bed. And then I wake up the next day super groggy and cranky and just tired all day like a zombie. And then I have to go to work, and I'm just so tired at work, and I feel like I'm just going to chop my finger off while I'm cutting the meat because I'm half asleep while I'm at work. And okay, I'm sorry. A little rant. She was just going to bed around 2 a.m. when she was disturbed by a strange humming sound. At first, she took it for the central heating, but then she realized that it was something unfamiliar. A flash outside her window caused her to look out. She saw a bluish light circling around, pulsating as it went. She got her binoculars and saw an oval object resting on the ground, and near it, two figures in whitish, plasticated clothing like boiler suits. They had no faces. When the local newspaper printed a picture of a hoax spaceman and suggested that this is what she had seen, she wrote an indignant denial. With cases such as these being reported almost every week, it's not surprising that as early as February 17th, investigator Randall Jones Pugh commented to a local newspaper, "There's certainly a minor flap down here." On April 28th, he told the same paper that he was planning a book on the sightings. No doubt he was encouraged in this venture by a further series of events which were even more extraordinary. The astonishing incidents reported by the inhabitants of Ripperstone Farm, just south of Broadhaven.
Billy, it's time you headed for the toothbrush.
Daddy, did you use the color?
But I didn't have these. A box of old crayons is all I had. And I didn't have a color TV either.
You didn't have lots of things.
Yeah, well, that's right. And here's something else I didn't have. Advanced Formula what?
Crest.
With Floristat. And Floristat helps keep cavities away even better than the Crest I grew up on. That means you could get even fewer cavities than I did. That's why I want you to brush. Come on, Billy. You got school tomorrow.
Tell me what else you didn't have.
You?
With Advanced Formula Crest, your kids could have even fewer cavities than you did.
Billy Combs was a herdsman, one of 3 men responsible for looking after the dairy herd at Ripperston Farm on behalf of the farm manager, Richard Hewison, who lived at neighboring Lower Broadmoor Farm and was in turn responsible to the company that owned both farms. Mr. Combs and his wife, Pauline, lived with their 5 children in a cottage on Ripperston Farm. Immediately next door was another cottage where Brian Class, also a Ripperston employee, lived with his wife, Caroline. Although Pauline Combs reported some earlier UFO experiences, the first major event occurred on April 16th. She was driving home one evening after dark with 3 of her children when her 10-year-old son, Kieran, who was in the back seat, reported a strange light in the sky. It was about the shape and the size of a rugby ball, luminous yellowish, with a hazy grayish light underneath and a torch-like beam shining down from it. Kieran told his mother that the light had U-turned and was following them. The object caught up with the car and traveled along beside it, at which point the car lights started to fade. Near the house, the engine cut out altogether, so that Mrs. Combs had to coast the rest of the way home. She ran in to call her husband. He and their eldest son, Clinton, came out just in time to see the UFO heading out to sea. When Mr. Combs tried to start the car, it functioned perfectly. A few weeks later, Mrs. Combs reported seeing another UFO from her kitchen window. It was about 20 feet in diameter and rested about 3 feet off the ground. Silvery in color, it had antennae and a tripod undercarriage. It took off toward the sea, leaving a circular burn mark. On another occasion, 2 of the younger children claimed to have seen 3 UFOs in the sky, circular in shape and with domes. One was about 50 feet above the ground, and from it a ladder was lowered, down which the children saw a silver-suited figure climb. The UFO dropped a bright red, fluorescent box-like object into the grass of the field. Later, the children looked for the box, but it had apparently disappeared. On April 22nd, Mr. and Mrs. Combs were watching a late-night film on television despite interference, which was particularly bad that evening. At about 11:30 p.m., Mrs. Combs became aware of a glow outside the uncurtained sitting room window. An hour or so later, her husband saw a face at the window. "It was a man, but a terrible size," he said. He later reported, estimating the height of the figure nearly 7 feet tall. The creature was wearing a white suit. His face, if it had one, was concealed behind a kind of black visor. Terrified, Mr. Combs telephoned first the farm manager, Richard Hewison, and then Randall Jones Pugh, the local British UFO Association investigator. Pugh advised him to inform the police. Hewison came around at once, followed by the police. They found no trace of the intruder. About 3 weeks later, a similar figure was sighted by the 8-year-old twins. They were out in the fields playing roly-poly in the grass when they saw an entity that they described in almost the same terms as their parents had. It was dressed in silver with a black head. It walked past them about 50 feet away and then disappeared, apparently having walked through a barbed wire fence. A little before 8 a.m. on March 26, Saturday, Josephine Hewison of Lower Broadmoor Farm, whose husband Richard manages the farm that includes Ripperston, was standing at her bedroom window. In a field just beyond the drive that circles around the front of the house, she saw a massive object, some 50 feet wide, large enough to hide almost completely a greenhouse that stood behind it. It had a round, 3-tiered shape, a broad base, and then a rounded ridge with a dome above. The whole thing, in Mrs. Hewison's words, was rather like a squashed jelly mold. It was smooth, bulbous, luminous colored. There was no sound, no indication of activity. It was full daylight but overcast, which invalidates the theory that she might have been dazzled by sunlight reflected from the greenhouse. She gazed at it for about 2 minutes and then realized she ought to tell somebody else. She went to wake her children, but when they looked out the window again, the object had vanished. Early one evening in October, Pauline Combs was driving to Ripperston with her mother and some of the children when her mother saw a disc-shaped UFO fly overhead towards Stack Rocks, which stands out at sea some distance from the mainland. The UFO circled the rocks and then dived into them through what appeared to be sliding doors. Alarmed, they continued on their way. Hardly had they arrived home when the telephone rang. Mrs. Granville of the Havenfort Hotel had seen a flash in the sky, which had prompted her to fetch her binoculars to examine Stack Rocks. She had seen figures climbing about on the rocks, and wondered if Mrs. Combs had seen any such thing. Mrs. Combs immediately set off from the farm toward the cliff, accompanied by some of the children, to obtain a better view. According to the reports, they came back confirming Mrs. Granville's sighting. Of all the events that were reported from Ripperstone Farm, the most bizarre was the seemingly supernatural movement of cattle. On several occasions, Billy Combs found that the cattle, sometimes only one or two animals, but frequently the entire herd, had disappeared from the yard. On at least one occasion, he received an angry telephone call from a neighboring farmer asking him to come and collect his herd. Mr. Combs insisted that the animals had been properly fastened in, adding that he had secured the boat with binder twine as an extra precaution. To escape in the way indicated, the herd would have to move past the cottage, yet neither he nor his wife had heard a sound. On one occasion, he reported, there simply had not been enough time between the moment at which the cattle had been seen and the moment when they were reported at another farm for them to have traversed the distance in any natural way. The implication had to be that they had somehow been spirited from one place to another. The cattle were badly frightened, and the milk yield was down. The proliferation of incidents at Ripperstone Farm made it a focus of interest for reporters and investigators on and off throughout the spring and summer of 1977. And perhaps it was only to be expected that sooner or later those mysterious figures, the sinister men in black, should be reported as turning up at the farm. One day, so the account alleges, an unusual car drove up, but silently, so that no one heard it. It contained two men who were remarkably similar in appearance. One of them got out, immaculately dressed in a neat gray suit and gleaming shoes. He was inspecting the cattle yard when Carolyn Class first saw him from her cottage next door. Yet in some uncanny way, he was instantly beside her, asking where Pauline Combs was, somehow knowing that Mrs. Class was not her. He is described as speaking with a foreign accent and having something alien about him. He possessed large, penetrating blue eyes, which seemed to go right through her and examine her thoughts. The report alleges that the Combs' eldest son, Clinton, was in the neighboring cottage at the same time, but was too frightened by the visitors to open the door for them. Instead, he bolted it and hid upstairs. Failing to get an answer to his knock, the man returned to Mrs. Class and pressed her for further information, though he seemed to know her answers before she uttered them. Then he asked her to show them how to reach the next destination, and the two men set off in their strange vehicle. A few seconds later, Mrs. Combs arrived in her car. Investigators commented on the fact that, although there was no turning off the lane by which she had come, Mrs. Combs had not passed the two men. How could she have missed them? So there you go. What do you think of the Welsh Triangle UFO flap of 1977? Good stuff. I've never heard of some of those stories before. Some of them I've seen on sightings, like the school kids and stuff. There's a lot of other cases like that. School kids seeing the UFOs out in the playground and stuff. Kind of weird. And that's about all the big show this week. We'll see you again right here next week. Thanks for listening, and God bless.